there's actually this whole friendly world waiting for us if we just take the time to connect.
Welcome to the Tracking Connections podcast, and thanks for listening.
We feature voices from around the world sharing stories of working intentionally with deep nature connection in ways that transform lives, families, projects, and communities. I'm Sarah.
I'm Aiden.
And I'm John.
And we are your hosts from Living Connection First.
Well, hi, everybody. This is John Young.
Hey, everyone. Sarah here. We're together with Maria Buitenhuis, also known as Sky, and we're going to talk about Ecological Homecoming.
Hi, everyone. Aiden here. And welcome, Maria. It's great to be with you today. And please tell us a little bit about yourself and about where you're calling in from.
Hi. Thank you, Aiden and John and Sarah, for having me here with you again. Yeah, I'm calling in from Galway in the west of Ireland, or Éire. I like to use the Irish names because they're place-based, and that's been lost in the translation of names in Ireland most of the time. So Galway is a stony river that runs through what's now Galway City in County Galway in the west of Ireland. And Éire is one of the older traditional names of Ireland, referring to one of the original goddesses of this beautiful land here.
Yeah, Maria, I love this topic, and it's dear to my heart as well, because I feel like we're on the same journey, all of us here. And I was curious about the etymology of your last name, from Dutch. And it was like out in the country, a house out in the country. And I thought, what a fitting name. Like, born with a name that somehow is implied in your journey, And if only my name, Young, would work the same way, I'd never grow old, right? But it doesn't seem to be working. I seem to be getting grayer and older every day that passes. But, my dad used to say, I'm the only one, son, that when I proposed to your mother, I could say, how would you like to be young forever? So, there's always something in a name. I appreciate your journey. Tell us a little bit about Ecological Homecoming. What is that vision for you? What does it mean?
So I've been supporting people's nature connection journey for over a decade now. And I've been on my own for much longer than that. And Ecological Homecoming is a phrase that came to me when I was looking for a name to describe the journey I've experienced myself and supported and seen in so many other people. And I'm always trying to find the words for it over the years. And I think if I was try to say it as concisely as possible, it's like a felt sense in the body of being home in nature, which is actually life, because all of life is nature. So a felt sense of being home. And if I think about what is home, what is that feeling of home? It's a sense of belonging, being part of the greater nature. And for me, that is both an experience that can happen in moments, like one particular experience we can have, one particular nature connection experience. And it's also how all of those experiences join up to fundamentally actually change who we are. That actual experience of our nervous systems rewiring over time, and we become actually a different human being. I've really experienced that in myself and seen it in others, in communities that are really dedicated to their nature connection journeys together.
You're bringing back memories for me when I first had that feeling that you described, that knowing I'm home feeling. And it got me winding back through my journey and thinking, what were the things that contributed to the arrival of that feeling within me? Right, because it gave me a great sense of freedom. And I remember I was somewhere in my late teens when it occurred to me, when I noticed it, because it had happened earlier than that, but I was suddenly aware of it and the preciousness of that feeling, because no matter where I went, I could always feel at home. So it was like I first felt at home in my place because I'd been going to that same sit area for, at that point, 8 or 9 years every day, and clearly that was a sense of home. It felt more home than my home in a weird way. And it was such a nourishing feeling, but there was a point at which where that nourishment transcended a actual location and became about my relationship with the earth, no matter where I was on it, right? So when I went to Austria for the first time, or when I landed in Dublin for the first time, landed in the Central Kalahari in Botswana on a little plane onto this airstrip, each one of those places kind of rushed into me as my home in a different way. But it was all based on what you were describing as that journey where all the different things we do start to mix together. Our nervous system kind of rehomes, I guess you could say. It's probably better to say it this way because my friend Kathleen Lockyer coined this phrase. She's an occupational therapist, and she's been using nature connection as a therapeutic pathway for occupational therapy, and she's been getting amazing results, as you can probably guess. But it dawned on her when she was in her training in university that people were talking about occupational therapy as rehabilitation. But she woke up with this thought in her head that was like yelling in her mind, you cannot rehabilitate something that has not been habilitated in the first place. So I can't even say it's like rehome in our nervous system, because I think if our culture was really healthy and really met us and helped us get that sense of belonging, because I think that's the job of a healthy culture, we would have been gifted the feeling of home from early childhood, right? And for anyone who's lived a life where that hasn't happened for them, your nervous system is still waiting for it to happen, right? It's not like you're getting it back. It's like, no, those wires were never plugged in, so really grateful for your awareness of that and the preciousness of that. And I just am always grateful when I hear people like yourself sharing stories like this, and I can imagine the gift to all these people, because what a feeling it is. And when people notice that has happened for them, what kind of things do you hear them say?
One gateway species into this, or not species, like grouping of life, which is trees, because I've also done I spent about 7 years dedicated to training people to be forest therapy guides. And so in that work and other nature connection work, I've often guided people into deeper connection with trees. And I see trees as a real gateway into these experiences, because people seem to have a kind of universal or shared experiences of trees being really compassionate beings. And so it's a gateway into feeling held by nature. And then all the lovely ripples that come from that. So I've often guided people in the experience of having communication of some kind with a tree for the first time. And what I've seen so often with that is that people will come back from that experience and, in many ways, just simple invitations, I've done a few things before we get to that. And I've just spent 20 minutes, maybe half an hour, maybe only 20 minutes. And they come back and there's a sense of just awe in the body, like openness, awe, and celebration, and also some disbelief, because they were met in a way that they've either never been met before or have no memory of being met like that, or it hasn't happened for them since they were a child. And it's some sense of having gone and shared something with a tree, and through their senses getting some kind of response back, often a question or something they're looking for support with in their life. And they come back and it's like, wow, I just had a conversation with a tree. Like, that actually happened for me. And so there's a sense of all of those feelings I just named. And actually, in that same initial share about the experience, the grief already comes, or it comes at some other point after that. But it's never too long before the grief comes of, why have I not had this experience before? Or why have I forgotten this experience? Especially in the context of, it was just there for me. It's not like you have to guide someone for years. It could be someone I've just met for the first time, and we've been doing some practices together for an hour, and then they have this experience. So it's something that always inspires me about nature connection work, that no matter how much I look out into the world and see things that could make me feel hopeless, working with people it's like we just need to scratch the surface because we're so wired for this. And so it's not hard to bring people into these experiences. But yeah, then the grief comes of like, why have I somehow not known that this was just there for me? And then there's the why in my life, and then there's the why in my culture, and it all opens up. So I find those two things are very close together, both the celebration and the awe and the elation, actually. And then the sadness and the grief come very quickly after that.
I'm curious, Maria, John was talking about you can't rehabilitate something that's never been habilitated. So I'm curious what types of people you work with. I heard you alluding to people that have memory of connection with nature from their childhood, and then also people that maybe have never had that sense of belonging in nature. And also your own journey around your connection with nature. Did you grow up with that experience of, living close to nature and knowing nature was your home? I know that I had that experience as a child. I was very lucky, and I feel so deeply for people that may not have had that experience, because although I went through a period of disconnection through, going to high school and college and whatever, I had that touch point. I had that memory, and I had that longing that I was able to see my disconnection. And when I went into the woods when I was in my late teens, I stopped having that feeling that you're describing, that felt sense. And I noticed, wow, I don't have that feeling, but I had that, I could track it. I knew what I was missing, right? So how do you work with those people differently if you do? And I'm also curious again about your journey, because John, had the continuous connection, at least the way that I perceive his journey. He was deeply connected as a young person and held that thread right through time. And then myself, I had that deep connection as a child. I lost it to a pretty strong degree from my experience. And then I sought the journey back, right? And I started asking that question, how do I get back there?
I imagine that's really valuable as well, having had that experience of losing it and being in that inquiry of how do I get it back in terms of helping other people as well who are having that similar experience. And the people I do and I have worked with, when I was specifically training people to be forest therapy guides, I really enjoyed that personally, because all kinds of people would come from all different, well, at first it was more older people actually who would come and train, but then because I was involved really right from the beginning of forest therapy developing as a kind of framework in the West, and then as forest therapy became more known, younger people started coming, more like people even in their early 20s, and yeah, which was really lovely to see as well. But what I really enjoyed is that it was people from all walks of life would come, and all different levels of experience in terms of their own nature connection experiences. And the one thread they all had in common was that they'd all had a healing experience with nature that moved them so much that they wanted to help bring that to other people. And the lovely thing about the forest therapy framework is that it's a very learnable framework that people can step into. So yeah, all kinds of people. The last few years, I've been teaching more H Shield specific. So it's more people that are coming with some cultural repair awareness already. So they're working on the cultural layer as well in some way. But again, with coming from different life paths as well. So still, yeah, different kinds of people as well, but a little bit more, maybe deeper on that journey in the sense of understanding nature connection more, maybe in how that journey works. And maybe some of them are already working in that themselves in some way, guiding these journeys for other people. And then I suppose for me, what always feels really important is invitational language. So rather than designing something completely different, maybe for one person than for another, it's like, how can we keep our invitations really open and inclusive so that people can choose their comfort level and how they want to interact. It's always been a really big passion of mine to find language that's just simple, because I feel like these kinds of experiences are for everyone and they're part of who we are as a human being. We don't need to put any barriers in the way by using special language to describe that someone then needs to understand to access the practice. Yeah, that's something I'm just really passionate about. And in terms of my own journey, what you were saying about my surname, John, it's interesting because one translation for, or one etymology for Maria is beloved. So you could look at it like a beloved house in the country. And a beloved house in the country has been a really big part of my nature connection journey. And I live back at the moment at my family property, and I'm renovating the little cottage I was born in. I was lucky enough to be born at home here, and I'm renovating that house at the moment. But I think similar to you, Sarah, I was lucky enough to grow up just in a space that allowed for nature connection out in the countryside, about half an hour outside Galway City. I went to school, primary school out here too. So I just had all of this time when I wasn't in school, you know, in the evenings when it wasn't winter time, in the weekends. Is that classic story you hear about of like what it used to be like, you know, in the olden days where kids would just disappear and they would just be called in for dinner. And I have those visceral memories of being out in the woods. And I don't know how my mother would somehow get her voice to us, to me and my older sister. But I just got to spend a lot of time in the hazel woods here. So we have kind of a lot of low canopy, hazel dominated woodlands, lots of woodland flowers in the summer. Yeah, very cozy woodlands, I guess I could say. A lot of moss, and building a lot of huts when I was a kid with sticks and moss on top, and we would crawl in so that like that smell of the humus, which I think is so good for our human bodies, was really like I had a real intimacy with the earth in that way, like a physical intimacy, I think. And then huts was this ongoing thing right up into becoming a teenager, like, or they just got a bit more advanced, but always building huts and hanging out in them in the woods. And so really feeling like the nature around the physical buildings I was spent time in was an extension of my home. And although I didn't have any people specifically, like specific nature connection mentors in my life, I think nature just mentored me really. And then as I became an older teenager, my memory is that nature and the woodlands around here was a safe place to bring my emotions. I have a lot of memories of going out into the woods and having really big cries that I didn't feel I could have anywhere else. And yet, as time passed as well, I started, and you know, when I think back, my current kind of understanding or curiosity around it is that I think as I was developing into a different life stage, I was becoming more aware of the world around me. And so I started to kind of get a little bit scared out in the woods. Like I wanted to get to know nature on a different level somehow. So there was this sense of like maybe the boogeyman in the woods, you know, like, or an entity, or possibly being judged maybe for who I was, or so. And I think that was me stretching into wanting to a more mature relationship, maybe with the world that I was in. And really the big shift came for me then. Well, I spent some time then as a young adult in the city, like going to university, and always with the question of from when I was very young, I was aware of what was happening in the world through my parents. Yeah, how they brought me up. I was very aware of animal rights and what was happening to the environment. And so when I was a young adult, I went and did a degree in environmental biology and really wanted to work in conservation, but then got disillusioned by that and then went to permaculture feeling like, no, it's the practical skills I need to know. And then once I learned the practical skills, I started asking myself, well, actually, these skills, this knowledge is here. Why aren't we implementing this knowledge? And that really brought me to the emotional layer of why aren't we caring for the living world around us? And I was also learning all these different parts of the puzzle of the answer that I was looking for. Like I was learning about ecological building and organic growing and holistic healing and all these different things. But I had this real hunger for understanding how to actually shift things. I knew that these were really important things that were happening. And that's when I came across the 8 Shields. And the very first time was a 3-day intensive with John in the Fintorn community in the north of Scotland. Maybe I was around 27 or so. And that was the first time I was sent out on sit spots with a sacred question, which was totally new for me at the time. And I can still remember the sit spot. I think it was maybe a birch tree behind me. And this like first experience, or it was one of the first experiences in a bundle of them, of bringing a question out with me and feeling like I received an answer. And that just opened up, yeah, a real transformation in my life. What I didn't realize up till then was that I actually had this huge loneliness where I was only deeply connected to the human world as an adult. And what that opened up for me was that I belong to all of life and not just the human world. And all of life and nature is the one, as long as we live on this planet Earth, will always be here with us. And so that gave me a grounding in life that was just huge. It completely transformed my life, and the trust I got from that in life, and the holding, and this idea of Mother Nature that was always in my head, because I knew we receive everything from the biosphere that we need. So of course the biosphere is like a mother or a parent. And then that dropping into an actual visceral experience of being held that felt like a mother or a parent from nature. And so from then on, I've always felt held in life. And depending on how active or how much time I'm spending on my own nature connection journey, that can feel more powerful or less powerful, but it's never gone away since then. And so for me, that ecological homecoming is really that sense of a two-way intimacy with life. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. So I lived by the ocean on the coast of Maine for my first 25 years. And then I moved to New Mexico, which is a beautiful place and clearly no ocean. It was such a transition for me to not have that element in my life. And people would say, the desert's kind of like the ocean. I heard that so many times, and I'm like, it's really not. It's really not the ocean. I was so bonded to the ocean. And then suddenly it wasn't there. And it was like, whoa, what do I do? Like I relied on the ocean for certain things, right? Finding my personal peace, feeling cleansed, feeling revitalized. And then suddenly I had mountain and desert. And it took me about 5 years to not go into deep depression especially summertime was like, I was in the ocean, and to find a new sense of home in that place, a new sense of bonding, a new sense of trust even, and ways of communicating with that big sky and those tall mountains, to get to know that new place. So my question is, what would you say to people who have been displaced? Would they say that, moving home is one of the biggest traumas? It's like divorce, death, and moving home. So what would you say to that? And so then there's also the scale, of course, of people being removed from their homeland ancestrally, right? Their ancestral homeland. So, I have mixed heritage. My ancestors are from, many, many places, and I live in California, right? So, which is fine. And again, I do find connection, like John was talking about, that sense of connection wherever you go, you bring it with you. I believe that is true. I experience that to be true. So is it bonding to one place? Like I hear also the beauty of the trees and their presence and their availability, right? Like I can go to a city park and find a tree. Is that enough, to find my way back if I've been displaced?
I think what comes to me listening to you is like nature community. Like if we would go to a new place, the same as we would, like the importance of finding human community to belong to, and finding where are those openings to meeting people. Yeah, it just came to me around finding the nature community wherever you land, because we can look around a landscape and it can feel like this whole unknown landscape. And yet, if we sit in one place for 20 minutes and really pay attention, we're going to meet all of these little individuals. It could be a little insect that comes onto us, or the way the wind moves, or maybe it's the tree by us. But there's such intimacy just waiting for us. And the comfort and the solace, I think, we find in that intimacy. And I also think about one of my teachers, Salvatore Gencarelli, who was adopted into the Lakota people, he says this phrase, and I'm guessing maybe it came from his Lakota grandmother. I'm not sure. That's just what I imagine. But when you take one step towards creation, creation takes 99 steps towards you. And I've felt that so many times in my life, where it doesn't matter how long I haven't taken the time to have an intimate experience with nature. As soon as I show up, nature is there for me. So there's actually this whole friendly world waiting for us if we just take the time to connect. Or maybe friendly isn't the right word, but this open world of all the beings in nature. Yeah, just to open ourselves up to the community that is wherever we've landed, because there are individuals, but there's also just this benignness that I experience over and over in nature as well. And this holding, yeah, that's just there for us no matter how long we've forgotten. And a bit like what I was saying around the experiences with trees, and a similar experience to that's happened to me many times with leading a sense meditation, which is something I first learned in H. Shields programs. Just the simplicity of guiding people to have their eyes closed and to close their dominant sense so they can really feel their other senses alive. And I've so often done that as the first experience in guiding people in nature connection. So it's maybe the first 15 minutes of what we do together after we've greeted each other and people are welcomed and settled in. And I've seen people just crying after just 10 minutes of a really simple invitation and saying things like, I've never felt that way, or I haven't felt this in so long. So I so often read that in poetry as well, this like sense of the world is just waiting for us to belong, actually, to connect and to belong ultimately.
That is beautiful. Thank you so much. Nature wants to connect with us. And I just love you painting that picture for us. Thank you.
Yeah. And when you're sharing about, everything is waiting for you, it reminded me of David Whyte's poem, By That Name. And he has a line in that poem. He says, put down the weight of your aloneness and ease into the conversation. And I think nature connection allows us to do that in a way that our own built world does not. Again, to quote another person, David Abram says this incredible line. He says that we only know what it is to be human in connection and conviviality with that which is not human. And so it is that we actually discover our own humanity by being reflected in the more than human world, right? In the web of life and in the natural world. And, you said it's not quite friendship, it's more like openness, but I think friendship maybe is the closest metaphor that we would have experienced, or maybe like best friends, because I think a tree has an ability to express unconditional acceptance. You could call it love, I suppose, if you wanted, but the tree can meet you unconditionally in a way that we really maybe are incapable of as humans ultimately. I think as much as we strive, we still are sitting there with our own human experience and our judgments and our perspective, whereas the tree just meets you, and it's just such an incredible experience. And that first time when you're sitting alone and you see a little bird peep out of the bushes and show up, and then it's like there is just something, I think this is inherent in all of us, that we just have this deep desire to know that bird the moment we see it, and it pulls at us in this way. And in our human world, we've created all of these different things to catch our attention and try to hold our attention. And then you go and you experience nature and you go, oh, wait, this is what we've been trying to do. And we never really manage it in a way that just that one little bird making its appearance, right? The story you shared with us before we started recording, right, of the Dunnock, and this incredible unfolding that happens as you are met with a mystery, and then you pursue that mystery, and then it becomes part of your knowing, right? And thinking back to my own childhood, there was a white pine tree on the edge of our property, and I would just go to that white pine tree almost every day and just climb to the very top of it and just sit there and just be held in those branches and look out over the forest, and to feel that experience, and to have that was so, oh, just so nourishing. And, I have had this experience as someone who has been displaced many times in my life, and then had that experience of the reconnecting. And it is just waiting for me, really. Every time it was right there. But the other side of this is that as humans, we do also have that desire to share this story and this experience with other humans. We don't want to be alone in that. And so I wonder, what you could say about that part of it, about the people connection and going on this journey with others.
Yeah, I feel because these are practices that most people in Western society weren't really, most people in Western society, I feel, were not brought up with. It can be quite countercultural to go sit with a tree, certainly to have a conversation with a tree in any way. And because of that, our culture doesn't value these experiences, or maybe it's not embedded, to make time for these experiences, for example, or to value them above to believe that they're important, So I think for me, that's the first maybe layer of importance of doing this together, that we value it, that we mirror that for each other, that this is valuable, this is sane, this is important. So how we can, mirror that back for each other, and how we can actually support each other to create the time in a really practical way, coming out of that valuing to create that time together, and really have these community of practice. So that's maybe signing up to a course or something in a practical way. That's how a lot of people would get that nowadays, I think. But then when we have community-based courses as well that are about really creating time to hear each other's stories, and to feed each other's stories, not just hear them, but also to ask questions, to reflect back. And I've noticed something over many years of that, and also from doing something called the Way of Counsel, where we sit in circle and really give the time to speak, that unconditional listening and really speaking from the heart. Is like when we verbalize our experience by telling it as a story to someone else, that already does something. That already integrates it into our body. And then also when people go beyond just unconditionally listening, which is already huge, not to have our stories judged, but then also maybe asking a question or reflecting back or being joined in curiosity about our experiences with another person really pulls on that story, in the sense of maybe noticing new things about our experience we didn't notice, seeing new things about that experience, learning from that experience. And then when we're all doing that together, we start to really grow as a community. Like, we start to discover who we are ourselves, but with the support of each other. So we're like growing together. And as that happens over time, I think we start to actually create a different culture between us. And so I think community is really essential to actually keep growing our personal nature connection practices. But then it's also really essential for actually creating a shift beyond just the personal shift, which of course is limited anyway if we're just on our own, because community is essential in personal transformation and growth.
It's so nice to have your depth of experience and all the different ways that you've tread these paths that are weaving together in your stories here. One of the things both you and Aidan were discussing, and Sarah as well, about going to nature for support, solace, whatever we want to call it. People have nowadays normalized the idea of an emotional support animal, that they even get to bring it on the plane. I think of Mother Earth, nature, as a giant emotional support being, right? And I recently wrote a foreword for a lovely book from Raffaella Cataldo in Italy. And one of the points she was making was that natural and normal had been separated in her culture in Italy. That she had this yearning to make natural normal and bring them back together, because it was not normal for someone to go out in the forest and talk to trees or, that sort of thing. And the normalization that you spoke to, having community, that, hey, this is okay to do, right? We belong to the earth. The earth is part of us. We are part of the earth. Let's act as if that's true, it's interesting. Even for me to say it, I can feel it get stuck in my craw, like it's hard to express because there's this pushback from somewhere and I don't know where it's coming from, but it's obviously in the psyche, the unconscious, collective unconscious of people today. And as you pointed out early on, how the two experiences of finding a communication with a tree, finding that it was actually easy, finding that it felt very natural, and then grieving. Why didn't someone share this with me before? How could I have lived my whole life and not known this? This is so precious, right? So I think it is really important for us to normalize what is natural. And I really hear you saying that. And I believe, ecological homecoming is a wonderful pathway for that. The other thing, you were mentioning Sal Giancarelli and then his Lakota grandmother, which would have been Grandma Chips. I got to know a member of that community and worked very closely with him for a number of years, Gilbert Walking Bull, who was raised with his grandparents in a very subsistence setting, literally a dirt floored log cabin, speaking of huts, right? They basically had logs buried under the earth. They dug into a hill because the prairie winters are so incredibly cold and fierce, right? So having your house at least partially underground was their solution, their winter home style. But growing up in this house with his grandmother and his grandfather, who never knew any way of life except the way of their ancestors, right? And, he came to see me one day. Out of nowhere, he appeared. And on a Monday, I had been standing in a meadow away from buildings, away from people on the edge of the wilderness in Western Washington and King County in the foothills. And I was literally crying to the trees. I was crying to the creator. Why is this so hard? Why aren't you helping me? I need help. I can't do this anymore. I've given my life to this work. I really need help. And we were really struggling financially. And we had just moved to Washington. There wasn't we didn't have a big enough community to support what we were doing. And gosh, we were all living on scraps and I was falling behind in my rent with my landlord, but he was very kind. He was really trying to support us, and he kept telling me, it's going to take time. Don't worry. It's okay. But I felt a lot of shame and I felt a lot of grief and pain that it was so hard. All I want to do is connect people to the earth. Why is this so hard? And I'm shouting at the creator on Monday. And on Tuesday, Gilbert Walking Bull shows up where Paul is working, my landlord, and Paul calls me and says, hey, there's this guy here who says he knows you, but I didn't want to just, send him up because I don't know who he is and I don't know if you really know him. And I said, well, who is it? He said, it's Gilbert Walking Bull. And I'm like, what? What's that guy doing out here? He's a Lakota elder. He's a holy man. Like, why is he here? He wants to talk to you. Is it okay if I put you on the phone? I talked to him and he says, yeah, I had some trouble back home and I had to get out of there because I was so upset. I didn't want to end up in an altercation. So I just prayed with my sacred pipe and I was directed to so many places, John, but eventually led me here where you are. I said, well, come on up, Paul, give him directions. So Gilbert shows up and he tells me his story. And he'd just been through some serious hardship, but he was in such a good space. He was such a deeply connected human being. And he said to me in that moment, he said, I come from a long line of holy people, John, my grandmother and my grandfather, and we have power of communication, he said. Just now while you're telling me your story here, why you moved here from New Jersey, and my grandfather spoke to me and said, grandson, John was standing over there in this meadow, and he pointed exactly where I was standing. And he said, and he told me, John, that you were crying at the creator. And he repeated word for word all the things that I had shouted at the trees in the sky. Okay. And he said, but what my grandfather wants you to know is that you thought you were alone so many times in your life, but you are never alone. You always, if you go out into a quiet place in nature, you speak, they hear you. And if there was ever evidence that absolutely underlined and put an exclamation point on that, it was that experience for me. Because I had no explanation. How did he possibly know what I just did yesterday? And to repeat it back to me word for word, I never forgot that. And now when I talk to the trees, it has a whole different feeling, you know. But I wanted to end with that because it's just something I can't explain it. I'm not going to try to explain it. And I'm not going to say that the cultural interpretation of how that happens is one way or another, you know, because when I work with the San Bushmen, they have their interpretation of these kinds of experiences, and Gilbert and his family are different, you know. It seems like everybody who becomes connected, so connected to a place that they are from that place, that they have made the ecological homecoming, and maybe it's been with them for centuries. They all have a version of this story, and they all have different ways of explaining it. But, you know, as my friend Paul Rayfield says, and I think you know him as well, Maria, he says all origin stories are true, right? That was the one thing his elders always said, because, you know, if you talk to a person from this belief system, their origin story is as true as your own, because it's very hard to figure out what is actually going on in this great mysterious planet and the family of life around us. But really loved what you had to say, and glad that you've come back again to share with us. And lots of good wishes and blessings on Ecological Homecoming.
Thank you, John. Could I tell one little story in response to that story?
Yes, of course.
Because it might be a version of that story that's possible for people in their backyards. This was maybe 5 or 6 years ago. I was renting a place near here. And I actually moved into that house right at the beginning of the pandemic. So what followed after I moved in was just months of being at home, glorious weather. We were so blessed that springtime here in the west of Ireland. And it was a place I had a really strong sit spot. And each morning I would go into the back garden, and I moved in there in the beginning of February as well. So I really caught the beginning of the nesting season. And I was watching every day this pair of starlings making a nest under the eave of the garage. And I got to see them go through the different stages of nest building. So they started with these long strands of dried grass, and the last stage I saw was they were flying in with dried ivy leaves. And I got to, you know, witness them bringing up their chicks. And, you know, it was this really beautiful time. And it was also the same time I was asked to be the guest facilitator for the East Direction for the Bringing It Home program, which is a program I then later started running with Peter Cow, who is also my colleague I run Ecological Homecoming with. But his partner at the time was running it with him, Rebecca Card. And she gave an invitation to everyone on it, which was to dare to go outside and to be asked, show me I belong here. Or, you know, to be asked to be given a sign that you belong where you are. And which, you know, and I use that word dare because that's a courageous thing to ask, to believe that we would get an answer, because what happens if we don't get an answer? And so I remember really sitting with that and being like, do I dare to ask this question? And so I decided I did dare to ask the question. So I asked the question, can you show me in some way that I belong here? And so I took out the chair that I used for my sit spot and I sat out in the yard, and I didn't know that I was sitting underneath it was either a phone or an electrical wire running above the chair. And so I sat there, and one of these starlings came along and sat right above me and dropped this perfect heart-shaped ivy leaf right beside me on the ground. And it was just this incredible, it's just your story reminds me of that. Obviously, it's not as epic a story, but it was that sense of touching the mystery of life and feeling so grateful for that little gift. Yeah, when I dared to ask, do I belong here?
That is such a beautiful story. And it is epic. It's just as epic. I love that. Thank you so much for that.
Maria, thank you so much for joining us today. And before we wrap up, I know that Ecological Homecoming is an offering that you actually have coming up. And I wonder if you could just tell our listeners a little bit about it as we wrap up here.
Yeah, so Ecological Homecoming is a year-long journey. Myself and Peter offer starts this year on March 19th, I believe. And it's online, but you do all the invitations where you are in your place. So I like to say it's at home and online. And we bring people through the 8 directions at that time of year. So we start in the east around the spring equinox. And we've mapped one of the core nature connection routines of the 8 shields into each of those directions, which is our own mapping. How we felt it worked with the flow energy cycle and different layers of the wheel. And for each of the direction, there's 2 calls. And so the first call, we introduce the core routine. So we start with sit spot in the east. And then 2 weeks later, we gather again and catch that story in community. And I think what's beautiful is people always come for the nature connection journey, and then they leave filled up by the community part of it and realizing how important that is and how that's really deepened and the journey for them. Yeah.
And we will have all that information of how you can find out about that program or how to find more about Maria. All of that will be in the show notes. So take a look there. And Maria, thanks again. It's really been wonderful to spend time with you and sharing these stories and these ideas.
Thanks, Maria.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I've so enjoyed this conversation with you all.
Till next time.
Thanks for listening to Tracking Connections. If you enjoy this podcast, it would mean a lot to us if you would take a minute to follow or subscribe. Following the podcast helps us, and it helps you because you'll never miss an episode. We'd also love for you to give us a 5-star rating and review and share an episode with a friend. To learn more about our current offerings, visit livingconnectionfirst.net. We'll see you next time.